Dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's podcast, being taken as the part of students' projects for the subject Political Psychology in International Relations at Charles University. My name is Martina Hlavsová, and I am studying the second semester of Politics and International Relations at the Faculty of Social Science, and I'm going to guide you through the podcast. A special guest for today's interview will be the Director of International Affairs program at STEM Institute and a former student of Psychology and Political Science at Charles University, Nikola Hořejší. The main topic in general will be populism and its practices towards society. I'd like to analyze the role of disinformation, fake news, and social temper regarding the politics. For these purposes, it is necessary to introduce some key psychological phenomena which could possibly have a significant effect on the discussed political topics. More specifically, I'm talking about the role of sunk costs and endowment effect, cognitive biases, and so-called System 1 and System 2 of thinking. Now, a few pieces from the psychological terminology. From the prospect theory point of view, sunk costs can be identified as our tendency to continue with something we've invested money, effort, or time into, even if the current costs outweigh the benefits. This kind of behavior is closely connected to the endowment effect, which describes how people tend to value items that they own more highly than they would if they did not belong to them. I find very important the cognitive biases as they influence our decisions, attitudes, and behavior in many cases. Confirmation bias is basically the tendency of individuals to support or search for information that aligns with their opinions and ignore information that doesn't. This tendency supports, in many aspects, the overconfidence bias, which causes that people are more confident in their own abilities, such as driving, teaching, or spelling, than is objectively reasonable. For our discussion, the third bias, availability bias, is just as relevant as the others. Availability bias stands for the human tendency to rely on information that comes readily to mind when evaluating situations or making decisions. Last but not least, it is necessary for us to see the difference between System 1 and System 2 of thinking. System 1 of thinking is intuitive, effortless, fast, and considered to be more cognitive one, thanks to which we tend to make many decisions against the rational consideration. On the other hand, System 2 thinking is much more of a deliberative, slow, and is considered to be closer to rational choice. So, this was the theoretical introduction, and now let me call the host for this podcast, Nikola Hořejší. So, I believe the recording has already started. And once again, thank you very much for attending this podcast. I really appreciate it. And please, could you just briefly introduce yourself in the context of the connection between the world of politics and psychology? Because you've studied both and it's really impressive.
Well, it's a long time I did actually study it. I'm more focused on practice, I would say. But so briefly, I am the program manager for studying such topics at STEM Research Institute. So my role is designing research studies on international relations, disinformation, etc., but always from the point of view of general public. What are their attitudes? What they know, what they don't know. Usually they don't know much, and then advise government bodies, non-profits, foreign embassies, etc., all the relevant partners on how to devise their programs, whether it's education, media literacy, or communication campaigns. So I'm trying to combine the psychological and political science view in those things, but I would say practice is usually way different to what you study or what we study and what's in the literature.
Yeah, I'm sure about it. That's true. So let's start with the first topic you are probably very familiar with, and that's populism. So, in your opinion, how powerful is this phenomenon of populism in the current political scene in the Czech Republic? And maybe what about the connection between the growth of populists and the social temper?
Yes, well, that's a pretty broad subject, but let's divide it into some things I find relevant or practical. So first of all, populism, I don't see it per se as a negative label. I think populism is can be both harmful, but can be both useful, because it's some kind of reaction to general frustration of the public. And we see that the Czech public is unfortunately increasingly more and more frustrated. First of all, because of domestic distrust to institutions or the society itself. We've seen the numbers of trust in the society decrease significantly with COVID-19 pandemic and staying at this low levels ever since. And also there's distrust to international bodies such as EU. So populism is a reaction to all of that. And I mean, the reaction can be both harmful or somehow positive, channeling the frustration. And that's connected to what we see that the left, traditional left or social democrats are losing in Europe and in Czech Republic their ground, and they are being replaced by what something I would call harmful populism. That is political parties that are, let's say, mixing the traditional left-right division, or let's say more affluent, less affluent citizens division, with culture wars, with hatred towards outgroups, with topics such as migration, minorities, but also increasingly climate change and international cooperation and international relations, especially with Russia and China. So that is something to focus on. And in the Czech Republic, I think that we are not trendsetters. We are somehow following the trend, which is across the Europe. And I think we won't see, rebirth of traditional social democrats soon. We'll have to cope with this change for some time.
Okay. And what about the motivations of these populistic leaders or populists? Maybe from the aspect of sunk costs and endowment effect. So, how massively, in your opinion, can they influence the behavior of a politician? How massively can these aspects maybe influence how they behave, how they decide their decisions, etc.?
Well, I think that, from also meeting some of those leaders and talking to them, seeing their work, I would say that there's always a mix of motivation. One being a feeling that they are not, or that their views are not represented enough, and the other being pure materialistic, or let's say pragmatic reasons to build your power base and to have power to control stuff. So in Czech Republic we have both the sort of pseudo oligarch who is there mainly to damage control to control the possible damage to his business dealings and to his interests. And on the other hand, smaller anti-system parties, which are more about getting attention, getting a base of loyal fans, and then maintaining them at power. So these people are always, hardworking to maintain their position and power, which comes to those fallacies or phenomena you mentioned. But also, it's frank to we should say that there was a great undersoil, a great chance for them to succeed, because how some of the parties were neglecting the public trust and how they were sort of playing into their hand with lack of transparency, with lack of honesty, and lack of also vision or communication with citizens. It comes generally to problem of political parties which are too small to function as broad democratic fora, and they are having tribes or small groups to control them. As once Karel Schwarzenberg told me, it's easy to found a party, but its main party and not let you get in and control the party. So this is basically the core problem of the Czech political system.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, this is air condition again. There's not a sound ruining
No
it.
problem. No problem. I do hope we'll hear each other.
Should I try to turn it off, or is the sound okay?
The sound is completely okay. I hear you, so I believe we can continue. And so, is it more common to see, for example, this sunk cost fallacy in the case of populists than other politicians? Because for example, I can clearly recall some situations with Andrej Babiš or Tomio Okamura, who I believe we can definitely recognize as populists, at least to a certain point. And they claimed something and stood behind their statement, even though it was already proved not to be true or proved to be made up. But probably they believed that it will still pay off, at least in the eyes of their supporters or voters. So, is it more common to see these fallacies in case of populists than others?
Yes, it is. We have to, keep in mind that it's not just black and white. It's not just one-sided. When we looked at STEM's data, we see that both sides, if we divide people into two groups, which is not very clever, are prone to fallacies, are prone to conspiracies, are prone to disinformation. But surely there are more people falling for conspiracies or falling for misinformation on the side which is frustrated, skeptical, anti-West, or rather, not, for cooperation, and voters for anti-system or opposition parties nowadays in Czech Republic. of course, it is also there's a small group of those people who we could consider, democratic, but still fall for this. And when we tested this phenomenon during the last election, we saw that, it's very human to believe things that are supporting your candidate or are against the opposing candidate. That's a very universal human thing. And that comes to our belief that, thinking or evaluating information is more a social thing, is more intuitive, it's more about your preconceptions, less about, being rational, less about being analytical. But you are right in this assumption that there is more correction when it comes to democratic or less populistic parties. There are more mechanisms how the discussion develops and how people then correct their beliefs. But still, for some time, it's easy for anyone to fall for this one-way thinking or this tribe thinking of defending your own tribe and being against the outgroup.
Mhm. Well, abusing of the non-word information, made-up claims, and its impact bring us to the next part of this podcast, which is disinformation and fake news. So, please, could you describe some of the tactics of populistic leaders, or maybe just leaders, using alternative facts, so-called, and other pieces of information shaping the possible voters' opinion or those you came into contact with?
Well, I would say that there are many tactics, and it's not that easy to describe it in 1 minute. But the main strategy behind it, when we move to a level above, is to work with uncertainty or chaos. More simply speaking, it's when we studied how disinformation impact the society, we see that half of the population we would say is lost in the information space. They are not able to say what is true or what is not true, or they are even like distrustful to all the news and skeptical to all the news. So what is now being understood in this field of study is that, sowing doubts and working with doubt and with uncertainty, with opposing ideas, is the way how to prevent people from finding themselves, from finding what is real, what is not, what's a valid argument, what is not. And then when you are lost in the information space, the only thing that is left is to cling to your leader or cling to someone you trust more, and become more blindly binded to that person. So I think that's the strategy. That doesn't mean that this is like always working. We see, for example, now with Ukraine and Russia, that when there's a conflict which is more black and white and more clear than peacetime, then it's not that easy to defend one side with chaos or with uncertainty or with doubts. It's easy to get people, passive. It's easy to get people disinterested, but it's not that possible to get people, actively for Russian side, for example. There are the Russian propaganda and the pro-Russian disinformation scene in the Czech Republic is not able to build enough supporters of the Russian position. Doesn't mean that it's not harmful. It is still, making people somehow disoriented, but it's not a strategy that works at every moment and every time. Also, I would say that what helps is how fast is the news cycle, how fragmented is the news scene, how little gatekeepers or opinion makers we have in the field. So, for example, when we ask people who are the opinion leaders about whatever EU, NATO, world affairs, etc., they are not able to name any more trusted personalities. And we have seen in practice that public campaigns and political campaigns had stopped using public personalities and celebrities and actors. They still use them, but it used to be the number one way to campaign, that you got trusted personalities to endorse you. And this is not longer the case. So we see that the population is losing their opinion makers, or let's say traditional opinion makers, and they are turning to new ones, whether it's influencers for young audience, whether it's vloggers or YouTubers for older audience. But somehow the society cannot work just as a simple with a simple interface between media and population. You need to have opinion makers. You need to have the communication structured, or you need to have civil society to convey a real discussion about political issues in the society.
Okay, thank you. Well, you've already mentioned some reasons, but I would like to focus more a bit on the question why people tend to consider this information as true, as valid for them, because as we can see, it's all here definitely about the psychological side, about the way people think. And now, I mean, for example, to mention the cognitive biases our mind has to deal with. So let's start with the first bias, confirmation bias. Is one's tendency to search for information that is in conformity with his or with her attitude, an advantage for populists or for politicians or manipulators.
Yeah, sure, but maybe a brief note. Uh, in a broad view, there are all these psychological underpinnings of why we fall for conspiracies and disinformation, but they have been there most of the time. So what has changed is the circumstances and the ways we get information and we work with information, because these tendencies to look for confirmation or be blinded to facts that you don't like, it's very old, and it's been there, and it is estimated to develop a long time ago, and used to be very practical in social life and in peer pressure, which I think is the most important thing behind all of that. So what has changed is that the structure of the society, how the society digests information is different, and the media got from very powerful sources to something which is a buzz in the background of social media, of politicians shouting against each other. So that's one thing. And then another thing is the general distrust to institutions, frustration how institutions work, which doesn't mean that the institutions are worse than they used to be, but because there's more transparency, we're learning more about how badly they function and
Sure.
how badly they are designed. So I would say that these are the most important factors behind why our inherited tendencies are now more shown in public discussion, and uh, still it's nice that we can discuss conspiracies and disinformation rather than racist attacks or pogroms against Jews. The society has moved, but these tendencies are now manifested in different ways. Also, and I wrote an op-ed about it just yesterday. When we talk about disinformation, the problem is that we are putting too many problems into one. We are creating this zeitgeist, which is disinformation society, but then having such a big problem means we are not finding easy solution. If we look at it, for example, in 4 ways, looking at how media landscape has changed, looking at media literacy of population, which needs to improve much faster than it is improving. When we look at social media platforms, when we look at trust of the institutions, these are different phenomena which needs to be tackled almost separately, and not just putting Russian propaganda or influence campaigns together with homegrown frustration, etc. But back to your questions, and now I'm already like politicians not answering the questions. Sure, confirmation bias, all these things work there, but I think when we get to hardcore conspirations, and our estimate is about 1 in 10 Czechs believe in multiple conspirations, and not that like broad ones, but those really crazy ones. Then the thing is that it's a long way process. It's usually start with some disruption in our reality, such as pandemic, such as migration, panic, etc. It is something that is facilitated with some personality traits that's been studied, and then what is very important is your environment, and that's the same thing as radicalization, or same thing as sectarian behavior. That once you are open to this kind of ideas, you find people that are thinking similarly, sharing emails with them, meeting, then maybe in the end meeting with them, and that's a process that needs personal facilitation. It's not done just by media. It's not done just by reading the news. So I think that then these are the real bubbles. We are talking about bubbles on social media, but that's not really an accurate description, because social media are thriving on controversy. So they are actually doing sometimes the opposite of bubbles. They are exposing you to more radical ideas. But the real bubbles are then the small groups that are confirming each other. And when you look at I think the only Czech terrorist, homegrown terrorist, Mr. Balda, there's been years of indoctrination done by local sectors of SPD and by everyday communication by the political party he was affiliated with. So that's not a very fast process to do this. But then, unfortunately, then we see that once you fall for conspirations, it's very likely that you keep them and you broaden your portfolio. So most of the people that fell for migration conspiracies then moved to COVID conspiracies, and then moved to some, not all of them, but many of them moved to anti-Ukraine conspiracies. So it's a pattern that you apply to everything around you.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe now let's stop for a bit with the last two biases, which is overconfidence and availability bias, because to me these two biases seem to be quite connected, because people tend to believe in their capability to make relevant decisions and recognitions, but at the same time proceed from the shallow pieces of experience they find first in their mind. so that it's most of the time, or not most of the time, but in many cases it's not as relevant as they probably think to be. How dangerous is this phenomenon, or maybe these phenomena of these two biases in the context of spreading disinformation and populistic thoughts or manipulating thoughts?
Well, as I mentioned, there is in the psychological studies, there is a single trait or a trait, a personality trait that is very much correlated with tendency for conspiracies and false fake news, and that is sometimes a feeling of entitlement or feeling of, I would describe it as I'm not heard enough in the society. I'm not being respected. So what we see that, for when we studied the spreaders of conspiracies, you can have both very naive and let's say less educated people with low media literacy that are falling for it because they find it interesting, fun. They use it as a social tool to communicate with their family or to communicate with their friends, and they are falling out of it because they cannot recognize. But then you have another group, which we call expert spreaders, and these are people that are not doing it for money, but they are doing it out of belief, and they are, feeling some kind of power or return of power because many times they used to be in a sort of powerful position. It is some kind of revenge for injustices they feel or they think they have suffered, and these are things that are connected with overconfidence. But on the other hand, that's just a small group of spreaders of the, let's say, 10 to 11 percentage points of the population. But for the general population, the image is more mixed, and I cannot tell you exactly what's the very nice, neat single story. But the general population is on one hand saying we need to learn more about media. We are not able to find the truth. We struggle with how to recognize manipulative content. On the other hand, when you ask them, do you yourself validate or confirm the information you get? They say yes, because they think that by surfing 2 or 3 online media outlets, they are confirming what's there. So I think there are both things at play. First, the uncertainty, the feeling that you cannot find the truth, and that being skeptical, but in a wrong way, in a way of there's no way how to know what's real. For them, they think they're being less naive by being skeptical. They think they're being smarter. They are in a street smart way. They think they are being more prepared for future, and that they're helping their friends and family to prepare for the future if they are less naive. And for them, less naive means not trusting anything, and that's the problem. That once you start trusting nothing, then you basically are left in a void with no way, with nothing, no anchor, nothing to have as a lead where the society and where the world is going. But so I think and that's the way that's actually many times does happen with these fallacies or individual effects in psychology. That you have both or many at play, and the more important is maybe the underlying frustration, the underlying tendencies, which for some people end up with something which is completely legitimate, like being an activist or voting for a party or joining a party, and for other people, the means are counterproductive, like sharing conspiracy content, or trying to block everything, trying to be against everything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Now, I'd like to come up with something a bit more optimistic. So, how to improve the political environment? Um, and now I would like to mention the positive and negative attitude, because still, it's maybe seems like a very basic thing, but it plays a huge role. So, how does it affect our tendency to be more or less influenced by the cognitive biases, and generally by non-objective pieces of information, and everything we've already or you have already mentioned? So the our in our I mean ourselves, but generally the society, the positive and negative attitude, how does it affect our tendency to be more or less influenced?
I'm sorry, I don't know if I follow your question. So
Yeah, I mean, our positive or negative attitude, or our positive or negative emotions we have, how they affect our tendency to be more or less influenced by the cognitive biases, and generally by non-objective pieces of information, misinformation, etc.
yeah, well, um, that's a very good question. Of course, being positive, optimistic, that's a very, let's say, impactful or effectful way of being less prone to, seeing conspiracy everywhere and seeing bad guys behind everything. Um, when we look at the society, basically the general optimism, whether it's manifested in trust to other people or trust to what's going to happen in the future, is very strong indicator how people vote, how much they trust or distrust media, how much they trust or distrust democratic process, how much they think um, conspiracies are real or not. uh, this touches upon a very important thing, and that is that very often when we talk about disinformation, we consider it a problem of processing information, and we focus on, are those people clever enough, or are they dumb? Uh, are those are we educating people enough, or are they, do they lack information? That's important, but what's more important is this, general attitude of where the world's going. And this is usually built, by the big stories we have about the world, but the big narratives. So I would say if I had to choose between, teaching modern history or critical thinking, I would be in doubt, because I think critical thinking can get you that far. But we have, in our interviews and research, we have met a lot of conspiracy spreaders that are clever, they know languages, they traveled the world, and I wouldn't say they lack mental abilities, that they lack, possibility to thinking. They even think about themselves about as a critical thinkers, going into original sources of information, translating it for themselves, etc. But somehow on the way to, developing their ideas in the phase when you make your political opinions, which is quite late in the life, they get lost and decided, that the big narratives are not valid, and there is no reason to, distinguish between good guys, bad guys, etc. So in their case, I would go more to modern history. Of course, in other cases, with students or with people that are doing it out of naivete, I would go maybe for critical thinking. So not a single path. And as I said, that's maybe because we are putting too many different problems or aspects of problems together. But optimism is hard to sell. I had recently private conversation with the prime minister, and he said, he complained that there is no way to get the good news out. There's no way to explain to the people that we are getting richer and we are now overpassing the average of EU when it comes to GDP per capita. There's no way to explain to people that we could have been without gas, but we had managed. So, optimism is a nice thing, but very hard to sell. I would go maybe for vision. I would for leadership, for a vision of future, which is extremely important for any human being. I would go maybe for, and that goes back to your question of populism, framing the debates and we have in the society in the right way, because we have regular problems in the society. We have regular divisions in the society, but most of the time we are ignoring them and focusing on pseudo things. So, maybe not just going for life's good or will be better, but maybe, going for the life is going to be good if we solve this or if we focus on this and that problem. Yeah. And for example, if you look at the problem of climate change, we see in the research and in the data that too much pessimism, too much, thinking about the upcoming catastrophe or the sheer size of the problem leads to passivity in most of the people, because that's a very natural tendency when you're facing a problem which is bigger than you. You just shut down because there's no reason to spend your mental capacity to be stressed out and to be distracted because of something you think you cannot influence. So it's also important to build with people their feeling of empowerment, how much they can influence, because when you just show them what can be the bad outcomes of climate change and do not empower them, do not show them the solutions, many of them, and that's a very natural, again, tendency we should understand and not loathe, is to shut down and ignore the problem.
Okay. Well, now I'd like to mention the last phenomena, and that's psychological phenomena, and that's the system 1 and system 2 of thinking, because I was wondering whether there is a connection between the system 1, which is so-called effortless, fast, more cognitive one, and negativity. And on the other hand, system 2, which is deliberative, slow, and positivity of a of a possible voter, for example, but generally of a society.
I mean, of course, there must be a connection, since this is considered the fundament of how to analyze our cognitive functions and how to analyze our thinking about the world. Sure, it is there. It's an underlying framework how to look at these things. Well, the question maybe which interests me and which is more important is whether you can use the framework to help or to improve the things, and of course, everyone is using system 1 to process information which is not, of key importance for them, or is somehow connected to their identity or who they are. under time pressure, etc. As I said, increasing speed of news cycle or news consumption, definitely everything plays into the hand of system one. But I wouldn't say again that our goal is to move people to be those slowly, rationally, deliberatively, thinking computers or machines. That's maybe too utopian a goal. I think what is more important is starting with basic things like, when you have, for example, journalists and the consumer of news, the journalists would mostly be in the mindset of system two when they are crafting their articles and news content, but their consumers are most of the time, system one consumers. And you have to first at least teach those people to understand each other, and to see the two ways of looking at things. Also, I would say that this system one, system two leads us to false belief that it's all about rationality. That definitely we need to look at the lack of emotions in the real politics, the lack of system one symbols and cues when it comes to our narratives, or let's say the pro-democratic narratives. Of course, there are many experiments where you can see, how circumstances can help people use more system two, how to prime system one, etc., etc. There's broad literature of experiments and things that can be applied in small nudges. But my suspicion is that this nudge era of political decision making is a bit coming to an end, that we are seeing the limits of nudging, that we are seeing that this can be very useful when you want people to pay fines for parking more often, or when you want people to read their health records. But when it comes to broad public discussions, seems that nudging people is not enough, that more pulling people, more being leading by some example, leading by vision is the things that would inspire more broad feelings in the society.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all the answers. It seems like we are at the end of the interview, even though the whole problematic definitely could have and should have a considerably bigger place, bigger space. And well, it was a great pleasure to conduct a podcast with you. Thank you very much. And I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've enjoyed the questions as I have. So thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much. Good luck with the podcasts and all that. And I'm definitely keen to see what comes out of that.
Finally, a few words to conclude the whole podcast and the whole session. Well, I must admit that I was even perplexed how complex the whole problematic is. At the beginning, I wanted to, let's say, split the whole podcast to the three parts, including each one including some psychological phenomena and somehow connected to the relevant politics or politics in practice. But then during the podcast, I really let's say realized that it's basically not possible to split every single problematic into one column, because it's everything is somehow connected to the other things, and basically it's one big circle of several of many circumstances, so that yeah, it was really interesting, and I'm so glad to speak to Nikola Hořejší, as he is really a professional, and thanks to him I could really understand better the things we have learned during the whole semester at school, at the uni, but now I could really see how it works, and I hope that this podcast will help others, at least just as it helped me. So yeah, it was really interesting and impressive, and yeah, that's basically it. So thank you very much for attending this podcast, for listening to this podcast, and I do hope you've enjoyed it just as I did. So thank you, thanks all of you, and have a nice day.